And you all have had this experience, I guarantee, right? If you're in this room, I am sure that you've had an experience at some point in the past where you go to somebody and you're talking to them and their eyes glaze over, or they just say, why are you so worked up about this, right? Either, maybe you've heard that before, right? Either it's all going to work itself out, or there's nothing you can do. But either way, right? Why do you care so much about all this and that? Why do you get yourself worked up? So I wanted to talk about that because I think that we'll talk about the Electoral College, and we can talk in Q&A about other particular constitutional issues. There's so many fights on so many fronts that we have to wage in the 21st century in our great country. But I think we win or lose by asking the bigger question. And it's how I wound up getting engaged in politics and policy, because my parents aren't political. They kind of came of age and got interested in things, about the same time or a little behind me. I was a kid. I was in middle school in Washington State in the Seattle area, and I was brought up by people who were patriotic but not political, right? And we all have friends who are patriotic but not political. I actually think most Americans fit in that category, right? People love this country, but they're not sure how to do anything about that. And my family was patriotic but not political, but I started to notice something because my dad was a small businessman. He was in the business of building houses for people. And I thought, this is a laudable thing, right? You kind of think, this is a good thing. We're building houses for people. My dad goes out and he builds houses. He remodels houses. He makes things with his hands like it says in Scripture, right? This is a good, creative enterprise. And I came to understand through a few experiences that I won't get into that there were a lot of people who viewed this as a bad thing, especially people who worked in government, Seattle after all. Right? And my parents more and more became concerned that the people running our local and state government really did not have our best interests at heart. Right? And I came to realize, actually, as a student in public school, that some of the policies that my teachers, the people who I liked and respected and learned a lot from, some of the policies and politics that they supported were some of the things that made life harder for my dad. The hardest working guy that I knew. And how could this be? So I tell people, my personal mission evolved to be, during the time I was in high school and in college and through an experience I'm going to share with you in just a minute, trying to figure out what is it that makes this country exceptional? And if there is something there, right? If there is something that we can identify that makes this country exceptional, how can I be a part of preserving it and passing it on? And a lot of this crystallized for me when my wife and I were married and I just finished college. We moved to Washington, D.C., and really for the first time in my life, I met a couple of people who had not grown up in the United States. And my wife and I, we were house parents for an intern house. You may be familiar with Leadership Institute, which trains young conservative activists in Northern Virginia, just across the Potomac from D.C. We were the house parents for their intern house, which was like a weird reality show, right? We were 22 and 23, and we were the parents, right, for all these right-wing college students who would come to D.C., living, in that environment for the first time for these 3-month stretches. But sometimes Li would bring in people from other countries who wanted to come to the U.S. and wanted to have this experience. And we met a young man named Mussolini. He went by Musso. If your name is Mussolini, you go by Musso. His name was Musso Hamidou, and he had grown up in Uganda. Wonderful young Christian man, and we got to know him over the months that he was with us, and I'll never forget the thing that he shared that caught my attention. That he had never put a pair of shoes on his feet until he was 13 years old. And I said to him, he told us this one day. in conversation, and I said, well, that must have been exciting. And he kind of looked at the floor. And he said, well, that only transpired because I had to move to Kampala from the village where I grew up because my parents had been killed because they had become Christians, right? And we began to experience Muso's story, and why had he come to the United States? He said, this is the greatest country in the world. I actually have a quote from him that he wrote in an article back then. He said, "This is the greatest nation on earth, the wealthiest, kindest nation, providing more opportunity there than anywhere else in the world." And Musa said, "I want to understand why and how, and I want to take that back to Uganda and try to help people, right?" And there was nowhere else in the world to go but here. He also said, I should share this with you. He said, and he knew that he was right, by the way, about our immense wealth in the United States when he got here and started, walking around the neighborhood, and he saw all these people keeping dogs. He said, "You guys, you keep dogs, and you don't plan to eat them. You must be very rich." He was serious. He knew it was funny, but he was serious too. You think about that experience, right? Somebody growing up halfway around the world, looking around the world for answers to the challenges that he and all the people he knew growing up faced, and seeing one place to come and find the answer. We also met a young woman. She was actually a little bit older than we were, which is always awkward when you're, house parents. But she was 5 or 6 years older than me, and she had grown up in Georgia, in Soviet-controlled Georgia, and she would tell us these stories about having a hidden radio in her. They had an end table in their house, and one of the legs they had hollowed out so they could hide a radio in the leg of the end table so that they could listen to the Voice of America radio. And she said, she said, "I'll never forget as a young girl sitting around in November 1984 listening to Voice of America." She said, "My parents told us if Ronald Reagan wins re-election, everything's going to be okay." I mean, you think of a little girl, right? Like literally all the way around, Georgia's all the way around on the other side of the world, sitting there listening to a hidden illegal radio, to an American radio broadcast, believing, right or wrong, and I would say it turned out to be right for people living in Georgia, right? That her fate, her family's future, all hinged on what people in the United States were going to do at the ballot box, right? That was the most important thing for their life. I mean, that's a heavy burden, for one thing, to bear as an American. Our patronage, this is our heritage. But it matters not just to us, right? I mean, it actually matters to people all around the world. But why is it, right? And this is something that I had to stumble around in for a while, because you find all kinds of different theories, right? There are all kinds of different theories on why, of course, there are some people who just say, I think both major party candidates in the last election made comments to the effect that, well, everybody thinks their countries are exceptional. Right? Everybody thinks their countries are exceptional, and so let's not waste time talking about the fact that the United States is exceptional, because that's just, jingoism or it's an unanswerable question. I say hogwash, right? I think Musso is right. I think my friend from Georgia is right. I think they're right. There's something unique about this country. But what really is it, right? There are a lot of countries, for example, that have wonderful constitutions and wonderful bills of rights, right? And Ronald Reagan used to like to point this out. The Soviet Union had a better Bill of Rights than we had, right? A lot of you probably know this, right? They had a Bill of Rights. It was far more protective of individual liberty than our Bill of Rights, right? And you think about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. If you go back and you just read what the revolutionaries said, the French Revolution sounds Wonderful, right? The American revolutionaries wanted like lower taxes and local government and some things that from some people's point of view is fairly mundane. The French wanted liberty, fraternity, and equality, right? They wanted to be able to do whatever they want. They wanted everybody to love each other and everybody to be equal, right? That sounds wonderful. Right, so obviously it's not simply our political rhetoric or even our laws as expressed on papers that explain why we're so unique. I think that the argument that I agree with is the one that was made. It's been made many times, but it's made at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address. And you may not have ever thought of the beginning of the Gettysburg Address as a political argument, because today it sort of sounds like a rhetorical flourish, or it's beautiful writing. It echoes Holy Scripture, and we read it as an example of political rhetoric that our modern politicians can't possibly live up to with all their teams of speechwriters, right? They can't achieve what Abraham Lincoln could achieve on the back of an envelope during a train ride. For a variety of reasons. But here's what at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address says, and this is a political argument. It's an argument about why our country is exceptional. 77 years ago, our founders brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. This is actually a political argument, and a somewhat controversial argument. Because if when that speech was given, it was given in 1863 in November on a Thursday. It was November 17th. I know it was a Thursday. I don't remember the date. But if you take 77, right, you subtract 87 years from 1863, you get 1776, and we all know that. We just accept it. We just accept that today as that's America's birthday, right? But this is actually a political argument about what is at the heart of what makes our country exceptional. Because if you look at every other country around the world, and I've done this, I've done the research and tried to figure out, am I wrong about this? Is there any other country that's similar to us in this way? If you look at every other country around the world, they date their creation with the date of a military conquest, right? Maybe the beginning of a war, typically the end of a war, maybe a treaty. Maybe they date the beginning of their regime or their republic with the signing of a constitution, right? But we don't date the beginning of our country with April 19th, 1775, when the incredibly brave men of Lexington and then Concord stood up to the British. We don't date the beginning then. We don't date the beginning of our country in 1781, when the British surrendered at Yorktown, or in 1783 when they finally signed the peace treaty, or in 1787 when the Constitution was written and signed, or when the Constitution was ratified. We don't date the beginning of our country at any of those dates like every other country would do, right? We date it in 1776, and we all here know something that John Adams didn't know, at least not at the time. We know that we date it to July 4th, 1776. How many of you have heard the letter from Adams about how this day will be forever celebrated with bonfires and illuminations and solid acts of devotion to Almighty God, right? A lot of us have heard that letter. Does anybody know what date that letter is actually about? It gets read these days on July 4th, but July 2nd, right? Because John Adams was a good lawyerly lawyer. And he knew that the date that we resolved our independence was July 2nd, right? If you're a lawyer, you would say, no, American Independence Day is July 2nd. That's what Adams said. I'm a lawyer. I respect it. He's a good lawyer. But he missed the point, right? It's July 4th. We all know that. We accept it. We all agree with Lincoln in this regard, right? Our country starts with an idea. No other country starts with an idea. One of my favorite writers, the great British mystery and theology writer G.K. Chesterton said, America is a nation with the soul of a church, the only nation founded on a creed, right? An idea, a truth claim, right? We're a country founded on a truth claim. Nobody has ever done that before, right? We're founded on an idea that there are laws in nature, that they're put there by the creator of nature, who is God. Right? That human beings are creatures created by God, set in this world of nature, and that the reason why nature has laws, right, is the same reason that we have a mind, right? That we can interact with it, understand it, learn within this nature that we have, learn things, and then become co-creators with God, right? Created in His image and for His likeness. This is the foundation at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, laws of nature and of nature's God. No other country claims this, right? And so, frankly, implicitly, every other nation makes the opposite argument, whether they mean to or not, because there's only two real arguments about where government comes from and what government rests on. And it goes all the way back. I'm super wonky, so I love this. The argument we can trace at least all the way back to the 5th century BC. You go all the way back to Plato's Republic. Right, you go all the way back to one of the earliest works of philosophy that we have. And what does it start with? It starts with an argument between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Sorry for going really wonky on you, but this is actually, some people make the mistake of studying philosophy in college and they read all these modern philosophers and they think that philosophy is just all garbage. You go back and read Plato's Republic, it's a fascinating story about Socrates arguing with people. And it starts off with him arguing with Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus is this very practical Greek guy who says, look, you want to talk about justice. Justice is the will of the stronger, right? Justice is whoever has power over you, justice is just doing what they say. Because as a practical matter, what else are you going to do? Thrasymachus says, look, and I don't necessarily like it. I'm not arguing for barbarism. Thrasymachus, after all, is an Athenian. He's an educated Greek. So he says, look, I'm not talking about people with clubs, right? I'm not talking about North Korea, right? Thrasymachus says, I'm talking about society. We come together. We hold elections. And this is the organized way to have might make right, to have justice be the rule of the strong. The rule of the stronger just means whatever the majority says it is. Hence, tomorrow we have to talk about defending the Electoral College. As people say, shouldn't it just be whatever people say it is? Why do we have these checks and balances in our system, right? It's a very logical position if you stand with Thrasymachus. But Socrates says no. Socrates says, look, and he, if you want to know where The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings comes from, you just read a little bit further. So Socrates says, what if there was a magic ring and you could put it on and become invisible? I told this to my kids and they're like, wait, what? Somebody else came up with this before? This wasn't Tolkien original? It's like I said, I went back to Plato. You go back to ancient philosophy after you've read some of the modern stuff, and you just realize how, these people who claim, the progressives, right? The progressives, this is a digression, but it's an important digression. Right? The progressives are the great assassins within academia, and particularly within history. Because the only way you can convince people that today's elites are the smartest people who ever lived on the planet, and therefore we should all bow down before them and recreate society in their own image, is if those progressive elites first go back to history and destroy all of the heroes and great thinkers because they were slaveholders and misogynists, and or we're just gonna ignore them and pretend they didn't exist, right? I mean, the progressives, they have to assassinate all of the great figures from history first, and then they're the last ones standing on the battlefield saying, look, undergraduate students, how brilliant you are, right? We're the people we've been waiting for. That's exactly right. Right? I mean, this is people ask, why don't they know how to teach history anymore? They know how to teach history. They teach history the way they want to teach history. Yeah. It is not a mistake. It's not an oversight. It's a plan. But look, there's two sides of this argument. There always has been. And Socrates says, look, maybe there actually are standards that transcend any of us as individuals. And at about the same time, and a little bit earlier, there's another group of people wandering around in the ancient world a couple of thousand miles away saying basically the same thing. I just think this is fascinating to me, right? Because the Israelites were saying something similar, and it did not make them popular. They were like the conservative kids on a college campus today saying, well, maybe truth is real. How dare you say that, right? How dare you say that truth might be? I mean, the Israelites were not trying to really push anything on anybody. If you think about that, right? They, at least most of the time, right? They're looking for a place to settle. Like a college kid wandering around college saying, hey, I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just saying I believe in truth, right? It's offensive to people. It's offensive to people now, and it was offensive to people then. And long story short, because I used to do a 6-hour seminar on this, which I love doing, because you get people like you on a Saturday, right? And you just think, who are these people who are willing to sit around and talk about this with me for 6 hours on a Saturday? It's like the most wonderful thing you can imagine. To make a long story short, right, you trace this argument in all of its iterations from the ancient Israelites and the ancient Greeks through the early Christians, through people like Augustine, who retells this story about a pirate who's been captured by Alexander the Great. And Augustine is telling this story talking about government. And capturing this same argument that was going on in his day, right? That Alexander the Great brings this pirate before him and says, how dare you commit acts of piracy on my seas? And the pirate says, the only difference between me and you is that you have more ships and you're better organized. But don't put on airs to me, right? You're a pirate too. And Augustine says, look, this is exactly what government is if we're side with Thrasymachus, right? If government is simply the organized tyranny of the stronger, then government is no different from organized crime other than its scale, right? That's all it is. It's just more organized. Or, I don't know. No, maybe not more organized. It's just bigger. Maybe it's less organized. I don't know. And sanction it, yeah. I mean, well, but within the mafia, right? Like, there's honor among thieves. Maybe I've just watched The Godfather too many times, but there are some rules, right? That even they, within gangs and organized crime, they're still going to have to follow some kind of mores that they've established for themselves. Ultimately, it's still the will of the stronger, though, right? It's whatever they can get away with. And Augustine says, repeating the argument of the ancient Israelites, repeating the argument of Socrates and Plato, maybe there's something more. Maybe there's a standard to which we can hold government. Maybe government doesn't just have to be organized crime at a higher level. Right? And you can follow this argument through the scholastics in the 12th century, and you can follow this argument with all kinds of twists and turns through the Enlightenment, and you can find people going off in all kinds of different directions. And then you come to the American founding, and you see these principles, these things that people have been talking about and arguing about for millennia, finally put into practice in a government like never before, right? And we see in American history, imperfectly, right, with lots of human failings, which we all know is inevitable, right? It's a part of this truth, right, is that human beings are fallen creatures and that government does not offer any ultimate solutions to those failures. But we finally see those principles worked into a regime, and we see the incredible flourishing to where in the early 19th century, you were better off to be, and this comes from historians looking at life expectancy. I won't make it vague, I'll make it specific. Your life expectancy as a slave in the United States was better than as a poor person in London, right? I mean, this is what we achieved. And the population explosion here in the 19th century was not that people were having more kids, it was that all of a sudden their kids were surviving. Right, which was unheard of. The reduction in infant mortality, and at the same time the increase in things like literacy that happened in the young United States was unheralded. Never happened in the history of the world, right? And again, why? We founded a regime based on the idea that people are actually all equal in their fundamental dignity, and that government can actually be held accountable to the people. And Thomas Jefferson had a great illustration for this. He said, look, it's not that complicated of an idea. Jefferson, very late in his life, was asked to explain something about this. And he said, look, we were just trying to pull together these ideas that existed before. We weren't trying to come up with anything new. He said that the idea is as simple as this, right? If you look at a horse and a man, you can tell that one is meant to ride the other and not the other way around. If you look at two human beings, you can never come up with an argument like that, a self-evident argument about which human being is meant to rule the other. Right? Lincoln famously said, well, if you think that because your skin's lighter, you should rule over somebody whose skin is darker, well, wait till somebody who comes along who hasn't been in the sun for a really long time, right? Then they're the boss of you and everybody else. Right? I mean, Lincoln just makes fun of this silly idea that Jefferson had made fun of as well. My illustration goes like this, and I don't have any pennies in my pocket, but that's okay because we all know what pennies look like. But look, if I had a big handful of pennies up here, right, they would all be different, right? Even if I went to the Mint, I've been to the Mint in Denver, which is kind of a neat tour. Took my kids there, and they give you the penny blanks, and they give you some fresh pennies that have just rolled off the assembly line, and you put your hands there, and if you collect all the pennies rolling off the assembly line, they will all look identical. But I could take them down to one of the universities here in Pittsburgh. We could put them under electron microscopes, and materially, every penny is different. We all agree on that, right? Like at a molecular level, every penny is different. Materially, the better our science gets, the more we can tell that every material thing is actually different, right? But nobody cares. It's not important, right? For all of you who have pennies in your pocket, none of you care, right, about the little differences and imperfections and variations in those pennies. That is not why you have them. You have them for one reason, because they have a value. And that value comes from the stamp of their creator, right? The penny blanks that I got from the Mint in Denver have no value. They have the same amount of copper and zinc and all the other stuff that's in there, right? The amount of that stuff is the same. They just haven't been stamped by their creator with the stamp that tells us what their value is. And that tells us that no matter how old or new or dented that penny is, it's worth 1 cent, right? Just like every other penny. This is that principle. And when we understand that, right, when we understand that people have equal human dignity, and when we understand that human nature is also flawed, which, as soon as we understand that everybody has equal human dignity, by the way, then we don't get to look around and say, well, that person's more flawed than this person. Or then we realize that our flaws we're also equal in our potential flaws, which is the other great insight of the American founders. That's not just something they said, but something they did. Because the other thing that they did when they created the Constitution, I always remind people with this, and then I'm gonna bring it forward and wrap up here. You think about at the Constitutional Convention, the American founders designing a constitution full of checks and balances and all kinds of things to make government hard, right? To make it hard to do government, to reduce the amount of power that you had in the House and in the Senate and in the judiciary and in the executive branch. Right? Who did these people think was going to run government? Well, they knew who was going to run government. It was them, right? And this is another sort of challenge. I mean, what other founders of a country have worked so hard to tie their own hands? I mean, this is what always goes wrong when people found a country, because they hate the past regime. They see all the failures of the past regime, all the corruption, right? This is what people talk about. At some point, Venezuela, the Chavistas are going to be kicked out, and there's hope for a new day in Venezuela. But the problem is, if they follow the typical human pattern, right, as soon as new people actually get power, then they say, well, all those things we wanted to control the past regime is gone. And we have good intentions, so we don't need those checks anymore, right? I mean, you see this over and over and over again in human history, and the American founders broke that, right? They broke that cycle and said, no, we're going to bind ourselves because we understand these truths. And this is where you get a constitution that's worth defending, and it's also how we judge the Constitution. Right, because it's not enough to go to people around us who are patriotic but not political and say, hey, we've got a constitution, we need to defend it. Right, we have to help them understand these truths, right, and understand why it's worth defending first. Oftentimes I get to speak to high school groups and even middle school groups, which are kind of my favorites. And that's always the challenge, right? We have to get people, especially young people, to get excited about it first so that they want to know more and so that they want to defend it. Because if they're not excited, right, if they don't care, if they haven't come to realize through some dramatic experience like my friend Musso or just through being taught history well, if they haven't learned these stories, they're never going to get fired up enough to care enough to wind up in a room like this when they get older, right? We have to find ways to help people care. And I'm gonna close actually by plagiarizing a little bit. Well, it's not plagiarism because I'm going to cite my source. But this fight is not new, and all of you know that, right? But this fight, not only has it been going on since the ancient Greeks in Athens, right? But the fight in our country over the Constitution has been going on. Has been going on for at least 100 years, and we have great people on whose shoulders we can stand as we defend the Constitution and these principles. And my personal favorite is Calvin Coolidge, and the speech that he gave on the sesquicentennial of our founding, July 4th, 1926 fell on a Sunday, and so they celebrated. On Sunday they wouldn't hold a big party. Back in the 20s, they celebrated on July 5th, 1926. And here's a part of the end of his speech that I think could be delivered today, right? It so well captures this fight in our own age. It also captures the solution, what we have to do to connect with our fellow Americans, the people who are patriotic but not political, and help to draw them into this fight, to stand side by side with us. Coolidge said, "Governments do not make ideals, but ideals make governments. The government can help to sustain ideals and can create institutions through which they can be better observed, but their source, by their very nature, is in the people. The people have to bear their own responsibilities. There's no method by which that burden can be shifted to the government. It's not the enactment, but the observance of laws that creates the character of a nation." I think, Coolidge recognized, we should remember, who gave us the Pledge of Allegiance? It was the progressives gave us the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Some of the early American progressives, they were very patriotic. And in their own way, they thought that they wanted to perpetuate our institutions. But Coolidge recognized the flaw in their design, right? They thought that government could do it rather than the people. And so Coolidge calls on the people. He says this about the Declaration of Independence. He says, about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, of 1776, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter, to the Declaration. Coolidge said, "If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers." And Coolidge concluded with this. And I mean, again, this is something you could say to a progressive on any college campus today. Coolidge said, "We live in an age of science and of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our declaration created them. The things of the Spirit came first. Unless we cling to that, all our material prosperity, overwhelming though it may be, though it may appear, will turn to a barren scepter in our grasp. We must," he said, "if we are to maintain the great heritage which has bequeathed us, we must be like-minded as the fathers who created it. We must not sink into a pagan materialism, We must cultivate the reverence which they had for the things that are holy. We must follow the spiritual and moral leadership which they showed. We must keep replenished, that they may glow with a more compelling flame, the altar fires before which they worshipped. Coolidge understood, right? All of this hangs on our principles, right? And hangs on our ability to communicate those principles to the people around us in such a way that they then will want to join us in this fight for our Constitution and for our great republic. So with that, I thank you. I don't know, Frank, can I take questions, or am I supposed to do that tomorrow? Okay, so thank you so much, and I'm glad to take any questions that you have. Thank you. And we have a roving mic. If you haven't read that speech by Coolidge, by the way, I'll put in a plug for my friends at teachingamericanhistory.org, which is a project of the Ashbrook Center. And they have the whole speech, which is very long, and they also have an edited version of the highlights of that speech, which is much kind of easier to read and pass along to people. But it's a beautiful piece of political rhetoric in the highest sense. Questions? Comments? Janine. Oh, thank you so much.
I guess if no one's going to say anything, I will. Thank you for coming, Trent. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
And thank you for your perspective and your understanding and your study. Trent came to my state several times to help us defeat national popular vote. His work has been invaluable to saving the Electoral College and to defeating the national popular vote conspiracy, shall I call it that? But thank you very much. And you're going to talk about national popular vote tomorrow, so we may have questions on that. I don't have any questions. I just want to tell you how wonderful you were.
Well, thank you. And I will say a little bit about NPV. Somebody can wave their hand if you have a question, but it is such a challenge because you come across people who very commonly who say, well, look, the most votes should win, right? We're a democracy. The most votes should win, and this is simple. And that's a very understandable position for people to take, right? If that's all you've ever been told, right? If you've been told we're a democracy, democratic country, right? Then that comes naturally, which is part of why I took on this effort. Because to me, the Electoral College is such a powerful teaching tool. I mean, I think the fight to defend the Electoral College and defeat NPV is extremely important in its own right. But it's also such a powerful way to go to people and say, wait a second, what's the least democratic part of the Constitution? Because it's everybody's favorite, right? It's actually anti-democratic. The most anti-democratic part of the Constitution is oftentimes the only part of the Constitution anybody's ever heard of, which is the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is explicitly anti-democratic, right? I mean, if we want to be a pure democracy, don't go after the Electoral College. Get rid of the Bill of Rights, because it says no matter how many votes you have, you can't establish a church, you can't license political speech, you can't do all these things. You can't, you can't torture people for committing crimes, right? I mean, everything in there is in there because there was a concern that you might have a momentary majority that wanted to violate one of those things. If there was no concern that the majority would ever do it, there's not that much reason to put it in the Constitution. And you can force people right into this tension. I used to tell people in Seattle, the hardcore progressives into Seattle, I would say, look, why do you think all of your food should be grown within 3 miles of your house, but you want all your political decisions made 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C.? Right? There's this tension in progressivism because ultimately people don't want to be enslaved. Right? They don't. Now, if, the place where these arguments sort of run out is when you get on university campuses and people are pretty convinced that they're the ones who are going to be in charge. Then they're a little more cavalier. But for your average American, you can use issues like this to kind of shake people. I mean, I think so many people, not physically, but rhetorically, we've got to find ways to grab people by the lapels and just give them a good hard shake. Say, wait a second, you believe things that don't line up. Right? You believe things that can't possibly both be true, and I'm going to force you to pick one or the other. People don't always like it right away, but at least you leave them with something to think about. And I think the Electoral College leaves people with things to think about. Do you want Donald Trump in Washington, D.C., or his appointees to have more power over his reelection? Or do you think it's a good thing that that power is pushed out into the states? Do you wish that Barack Obama controlled his reelection in 2012, right? Or do you think it's a good thing that it's pushed out into the states, right? Most Americans are, well, yeah, like I kind of like the states having some power over these things. I believe that decisions are better made closer to people. Is there a question now? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I'll stop filibustering.
Ricardo Davis from Georgia. You noted, in particular, Chesterton's quote. Well, you presented us essentially a case that if we were a nation founded on a creed, and that essentially was part of the DNA of our exceptionalism, then what we have right now is a full-scale apostasy.
Yeah.
And what we are dealing with is not necessarily an issue of the frame of a government, but rather the soul of a nation.
Yeah.
So to that end, and I want you to kind of keep going down this track that you're talking about in terms of how do you wake people up? Because in one sense, you can show somebody who's willing to listen and try to think through the consequences of their actions. But for me, the scary thing is, again, after a few generations of that apostasy taking control of our institutions of learning, et cetera, they really do believe that we are the people we've been waiting for. And that's why we have, it's not just tone deaf, it's really, there's no there.
Yeah. No, yeah, thank you for that question. So I think I completely agree. I mean, this is a real challenge to me because I work full time in public policy, and more I feel like I have to. I mean, as I just described, I have to look for ways to make sure that my work is not just putting a finger in the dam, right? Because that's pointless. We have to address the soul of the nation and not just these problems of these immediate problems of the regime. What we have going for us. So I'll start with the optimism, and then I'll go pessimistic, and then I'll try to come back around somehow. But we do have a Constitution and a Declaration of Independence that most Americans are patriotic, right? And every once in a while, the media will do a poll. What do you think of the Constitution? What do you think of the Declaration? Do you believe these things? And every so often on the 4th of July, the AP will push out something like this, just because it's a rah-rah, feel-good thing. And most Americans will say, no, I love these things. I love these things. I think they're important. Of course, you do the man on the street questions, right? And a lot of people turn out to love things they don't know anything about. But at least they love them, right? I mean, there is something there that is a starting place for us, right? People want to they want to venerate our country, and I think this is authors like David McCullough, Joseph Ellis. HBO did the John Adams miniseries that was really good, despite its HBO-ish elements. The Hamilton musical, which my family got to see when it. So I'm gonna disagree. So I think the Hamilton musical, for all its faults, it taps into something where, you listen to the interviews with Lin-Manuel Miranda, right? He's actually a great example for us on this. He says, he's a really smart guy on the left, and he says, I'm sitting at the pool, I'm reading this biography of Hamilton, and I'm thinking, why has nobody ever told me any of this before, right? He feels cheated, and I think a lot of Americans have that experience. They crack a book by David McCullough or whoever, and they suddenly feel cheated, right? We got all these heroes. It's back to the progressives as the assassins who have rampaged through our history. I think Now everybody has their own battlefield, but I think we need more people telling stories. I think stories, if you want to address the soul of a nation, we were talking at our table back there about one of history's greatest storytellers, Jesus Christ, right? I mean, what did Jesus do? He taught in parables, right? And look back to the Old Testament. I mean, what is the revelation of God? It's all these stories from the Old Testament about all kinds of crazy things. You know, we get I love the book of Judges, and then you go to Hebrews, and you get it all repeated again because there's so much value in telling stories. I think that, you know, if there are a few powerful storytellers in this room, right, and whether it's your grandkids on your knee or you know, kids at the library or in, you know, writing novels, if we could tell more stories, Americans will wake up. I really believe that. I wish I was a better storyteller because I think that is so powerful. And the Hamilton musical has shown some people what they're missing, like HBO's John Adams thing, right? It's got Americans saying, well, it's kind of weird. Like, I went to school for 13 years or 18 years or whatever, and like nobody's ever told me all this stuff, and it's fun and interesting and intriguing. It's at least it's a camel's nose under the tent for us if we can exploit those things. So I think that's the most important thing. I think that's what we have going for us. I mean, the challenge is that in a world where our families are breaking down, our churches are breaking down, our local sense of community and culture is breaking down. I mean, because of national cable news, which I would blame more than social media. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it started with national cable news because all of a sudden, right? If you're a high schooler and you say, I want to get involved in politics, I have an interest in government, right? In this world today, and it was the same when I was in college because we already had cable news by then. What do you do? Like, it's all federal stuff, right? 30, 40 years ago, what would you do? Well, you go down to City Hall, you go to the county courthouse, you go to the state legislature, right? Now all that is shifted. And it's the same way with culture, right? You know, well, I want to start a band. Well, but I can pull up every band all around the world on this device, compare myself to the best people who've ever played in the history of human recording, and in a lot of local, and all the people who would potentially come and listen to the local band or listen to the local storyteller, right, says, well, I don't have to do that. I just plug in the earbuds, and why do I need local culture? And repeat that with our churches, repeat that with everything, right? All our local institutions are just falling to pieces around us, not just in politics. Politics is mostly downstream of all this. If we can put our local culture together again, or at least plant some flags for people to gather around, maybe that means we're the remnant, right? For a very long time. I mean, it could mean that. As a Christian, I know who wins, so I can live with that, even though I don't want that for my kids. Maybe it means we plant the flags and people rally around and we make a comeback, right? Everybody's been doing what's right in their own eyes for a while. You know, sometimes the corner can be turned pretty quick. That's right. That's right. Amen to that. So, other questions? Comments? Okay. Yep. Okay, well, thank you all so much, and we will talk Electoral College tomorrow morning, I guess at 11 o'clock, which I'm really looking forward to because it's a good fight, and it's a fight that we've been winning because of people just like you in this room, and especially because of Janine Hansen back there who is in this room. So thank you so much.
Thank you.